to ask that question. Billions of euros have been spent these last year through different channels in view of supporting the EU migration policy. The question is, to what avail? We've all heard about the recent report of the Court of Auditors concerning the window of the EUTF, which is a damning report, as an example of these kind of issues or questions that could be asked. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will be focusing mainly on the internal dimension, although other parts of my work look into the external dimension, and whether, if we can take a deep breath and see, is there any optimism that we can draw through funding for the implementation of the pact? So this presentation, and in general my research, has been focusing into a broader shift in EU governance, which is this governance through funding shift. So actually funding becoming more center stage, and from a sidekick, a corollary, let's say, of the policy making process, actually becoming a crucial tool in implementing policies. In the external dimension, one can say that it is being instrumentally used to achieve also a mix of protection and externalization goals. The issue is, can it be used also in the internal dimension, actually, to implement the pact, to steer policy implementation? And also in my blog post, I will not go into full detail, I have been tracing a bit the development of the role of funding within the EU's migration policy, because it really started as symbolic politics. So only focused on one area, asylum, very modest actually amounts coming as a top-up, very modest top-up to national investments, and very, very inflexible. Actually, at the beginning, the only emergency component was connected with the Temporary Protection Directive, and we all know when this was finally activated, much, much later than 2000s. So things began to shift as the implementation gap widened. There were more, let's say, generous amounts, and also more flexibility built into the system. So emergency was disconnected from the invocation of the Temporary Protection Directive, but still it was quite difficult to mobilize even this component of EU funding. For example, it had very short time frames of 6 months for absorption, which overwhelmed national administrations didn't manage to fulfill. It was actually in the previous MFF that actually migration funding was further rationalized, more flexibility entered into the system, including 100% financing in emergencies, more flexible ways to have access to emergency funding, a bit more generous funding, but still, if we see a little fraction of the multi-annual framework. So just to give us an image on whether we can, or we came to anything close to a compensatory logic, as in national implementation being funded by the EU level. Really, really far from that. And it was, in fact, the quote-unquote migration crisis that brought a lot of attention to EU funding. Actually, the budget exploded beyond what was initially foreseen through tapping into flexibility mechanisms that exist in terms of the global budget, so trying to generate more money, if you want, for this area, but within still the framing of the previous MFF. What we saw during this period is not only the member states that we may have in mind, like Greece or Italy, seeking access to emergency funding, but also more unusual suspects like Austria, Germany. So we saw structural needs, actually, for EU migration funding. And we had some developments, such as the activation of the civil protection mechanism, which carries around non-financial resources around the EU, tents, etc., that was usually activated in the cases of natural disasters, being directed to the migration area. And we had the birth of an intra-EU humanitarian aid line. So far, it had been only in the external dimension that was immediately after its adoption activated for the benefit of Greece. So we saw a kind of patchwork of emergency-driven measures coming to respond to what were essentially structural needs. So what happened in the current MFF? Because the pact, if we think of the pact and the funding dimension, cannot on its own rewrite everything. The pact instruments were constrained by the current multi-annual financial framework, which foresees what budget will be available for this area in the current period. So there was no radical overhaul around migration under the new MFF, although there was a boost, there was a rationalization, there was this flexibility, additional flexibility element that was included, the so-called thematic facility, which is about 30% of each of these funding program. There was a slight boost, but nothing very revolutionary. There has been very recently, through the midterm review, an extra boost that the Commission managed to secure of 2 billion, which actually will be targeted as well to implementing the pact, and the border component, the border processing was explicitly mentioned by the Commission. So what could the pact instruments do within such a setting where so many things were already framed and constrained by the MFF? As Francesco will also explore in greater detail, there are a number actually of different solidarity type contributions that the member states can make available within this new cycle that Philippe outlined. And within there was this innovative approach of actually bringing fresh money to the table through contributions of the member states from the national budgets to the EU budget as externally assigned revenues. So new money enters the game. This does not concern the existing MFF as it has been set up. Of course, there are some limits to this approach. So first of all, it is again solidarity as a counterweight to pressure, rather than, so the member states need to be identified as being under pressure, then they must have access to the solidarity pool. So it's again a more exceptional approach than it being structural. And also we see that initially this is rather modest. So it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, but it is 600 million, which in the big scheme of things annually, minimum annually, is give us a sense of scale of what money is expected to come to the table. Then the second element is that the pact, as Philippe also very clearly outlined, gives much more attention to the implementation components. In this sense, also as another session will explore, through the new border processing, very clearly tries to outline implementation capacities and obligations for member states. And there comes the question, okay, we have, I will spoil a bit the surprise, enhanced obligations, for example, for member states at the external borders through this system. So then the question comes, where will this be funded? Can they tap in through some kind of joint EU funding to implement these enhanced obligations? So in this, when we screened the pact instruments, we will see a mention to the existing budget, to the MFF, including the extra amounts from the midterm review. And of course, we will have on the table the money that will come through the solidarity cycle. So this minimum 600 million euro annually that I mentioned before. But as the pact instruments were constrained also from the MFF, other than the existing funds and whatever new will come through solidarity under the AMMR, there was not much more that could be done. So just to complete thinking also of time constraints, there is indeed a greater awareness of what will it take to realize this optimistic scenario, if it will be realized. In this sense, funding has come, like in other policy areas increasingly in the EU, more to the forefront. But there hasn't been a radical overhaul of the MFF in relation to the area, to the migration policies. So correlatively, while there was this creative approach with the extra money through solidarity that come to the fore, there was not much that the pact instruments in and of themselves could have done to change the status quo. So rather, we should keep our eyes into the MFF as of 27, because this externally assigned revenue, for example, is a legal and policy experiment that could be expanded. It could be decoupled from solidarity. It could be enhanced in terms of amounts. Ultimately, we could have an MFF that actually foresees greater amounts, so more attention from the EU budget to these areas, reaching something as structural, let's say, forms of funding being available in order to implement them. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that we can all be extremely grateful to Philippe, Daniel, and Lilian to have